So maybe we can start. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is the last of this academic year, and we're very happy to have Sulin presenting her work on public signal and private action. And we are going to continue in the next academic year as well. So hopefully you can join us. Sulin is happy to take questions in between, so feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, and ask questions. And that's it. Floor is yours. Thank you, Sulin.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and so late in the semester for joining today. As Apraf said, this is work on right-wing protests and hate crimes against refugees, and this is joint work with Annalí Casanueva Artís at IFO in Munich. Okay, so we start with the observation that protests have been rising all over the world, both in autocracies and democracies. So this is, shows the graph over time about the number of protests worldwide. And we see specifically since, post-financial crisis that there has been a surge in the number of protests worldwide. And alongside this surge, there has been a large literature that looks at the impact of social movements and protests in terms of their capacity to mobilize, to persuade, and to bring about political and policy change. So this ranges from sort of seminal work by Madestam and co-authors on the Tea Party movement and how protests for the Tea Party movement affect Republican vote shares. It also looks at civil rights movements in the 1960s on attitudes and voting, also in the long run, and more recently, more social media-based movements like the Me Too movement on the reporting of sex crimes and worker mobility in France and the United States. But what has been less the focus of research on protests and specifically the effects of protests is what is the effect of protest participation on radical action? And we define radical action as a high-risk, potentially illegal action to achieve a political goal. And this political goal can either be achieved through established democratic processes or by taking sort of individualized radical action. And the question here is, how do people decide whether or not to undertake radical action when they observe the preferences of others? Yeah, and let me briefly just walk you through how we think about this process. So, as I said, radical action is a high-risk, potentially illegal action, and individuals may make strategic choices between undertaking this radical action to further this political goal or remaining inactive. This radical action has a cost to it, which is sort of the social cost, that is the social punishment or the acceptability of this radical action, and a fixed cost of detection and punishment. So you can think of, let's say, tax evasion as an illegal act with varying social costs attached to it depending on the cultural context. And the returns to this radical action also depend on the observed behavior of others. So we think of protest attendance as sort of a signal about other people's preferences, yeah? And on the one hand, the success of this protest will decrease the social stigma associated with taking radical action to achieve a political goal. But at the same time, the success of a protest is also a signal about the overall political preferences of others, which means that that political goal is more likely to be achieved through democratic processes. Yeah. So on the one hand, knowing that other people support a certain cause is going to decrease the social costs of radical action to achieve this goal. But at the same time, you may not want to engage in this costly action if you know that other people support this too. And so, in essence, you have these two countervailing forces that either mean that protest success and radical action are strategic complements, or they're strategic substitutes if people update their beliefs about the relative returns to radical action in comparison to achieving this this through democratic processes. So we look at this question in the context of Pegida. Pegida is the patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West. It was created as a response to the refugee influx to Germany, and it started as a Facebook group in 2014 in Dresden, which is the former eastern part of Germany, and still the stronghold of the political arm of this right-wing movement, AfD. Its founder is Lutz Bachmann, who is a convicted felon, and now he has actually been sentenced to jail time because of inciting hate at these Pegida right-wing protests. And the profile of this protest is sort of nationalistic, xenophobic, and anti-Muslim, with very close ties to neo-Nazis and fascist groups. And of course, as I said, the goal of this movement is a substantial reform in the immigration policy, as well as what they call a protection of the Christian-Jewish tradition in Europe.
Can I ask her, it's not relevant for research, but just as a curiosity, Christian-Jewish tradition with ties from neo-Nazis, so they explicitly mention Jewish in the...
Yes.
Okay.
So you can, because Germany has a very sort of fraught history, any sort of anti-Semitism is socially very harshly punished in Germany. So one strategic way of sort of veiling the xenophobic sentiment is to explicitly include the Christian-Jewish tradition of that movement. So that is something that they emphasize specifically to sort of be less vulnerable to lawsuits against anti-Semitism, for which there are very strict rules in Germany.
Okay, basically, we'll deal with the Jews later kind of attitude. I see.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, to follow up a little bit, the goal could be an official goal, or it could be unstated or unspoken goal. I mean, there is, I think, maybe I'm hallucinating, but there is a story in which this is also supported or subsidized by external, let's call it, Putin forces and things like that. Is it possible that this goal is just a stated one, and the real reason is something else?
I mean, the stated goal is sort of the deterrence and stop of immigration, specifically from Muslim majority origin countries. And I can't say much about, any sort of foreign influence, but we think of this as the stated goal, and people that participate in these protests may participate because of that stated goal.
Yeah, thanks.
That's how we think about it. Yeah. And in fact, the movement aimed to organize very large protests, up to 25,000 participants at its peak, and really inspired also offshoots across the country, not just in Dresden, but also abroad. One thing that Pegida does is evoke similarities to the liberation movement, to the peaceful liberation movement in 1989 in the former GDR, which typically took place on Monday and had a very ritualized and pre-planned nature. So it would start in the afternoon, people would meet, there would be a rally, then a round of speeches, and then a so-called evening stroll. And this sort of parallel is explicitly evoked in order to sort of position themselves as, you know, the voice of the people, which was one of the rallying cries of the peaceful revolution in the former eastern part of Germany in 1989. We're later, for identification, going to leverage the fact that these protests were very ritualized and pre-planned and always took place on Mondays. There were, of course, also other Pegida protests happening, but what I'll show you here is just the distribution of Pegida protests by weekday, and you can really see that the majority of these protests took place on Monday, and we're actually later going to exclude all of the protests that happened on these other days, which may have erupted spontaneously. Now, if you map just over time, completely unconditionally, the number of these right-wing protests and the number of hate crimes, you see that there's sort of a co-movement between the intensity of violence against minority groups and these right-wing protests. Of course, this masks a lot of, you know, cyclical dimensions that happen at the same time, but this is sort of a first, you know, visual test to see whether, you know, there seems to be at least some correlation between these two forces over time. The data that we use stem from different sources. So we have hate crime data on the location, date, and type of hate crime, scraped from a website that collects reports of these hate crimes from newspaper articles, police press releases, reports from local crime registers, community centers, and primarily also answers to parliamentary inquiries. This is very important because there's no publicly available data on hate crimes and protests, and the majority of this comes from the equivalent of Freedom for Information Act that are mounted by the left party, who are sending demands to the government saying this is the type of data that we would like you to report to us, and based on this, members of the parliament can actually get access to this data and make this public. This is also where we get the Pegida data from, with the location, date, and number of participants. The number of participants is typically measured with noise because the protest organizers report typically a higher number of participants than the police would report, and the difference between those two estimates also varies across space, but this is sort of one way of sort of getting at the public perception and public support of it. As I'll later show, weather data will be important for us because we're going to leverage local weather conditions to get at some sort of quasi-natural experiment to leverage shocks to protest participation. And we're also going to focus a lot on social media, particularly overall Twitter use and Pegida tweets, which we're getting from the Twitter API. We also have followers of the official AfD Facebook account by municipality type, which we get from Miller and Schwartz, and we collect pro-refugee tweets as well to get at counter-mobilization. We have an array of, yes?
Yeah, sorry. If you're gonna talk about this later, you can say it, but can you just clarify how things get categorized as hate crime?
Yeah. So a hate crime is basically categorized as a racially motivated crime against a minority group, which is categorized by the police and by pro-refugee organizations. So a typical hate crime, so the modal hate crime in our data set will be a group of Nazis assaulted an Eritrean man at this train station. That's going to be one typical hate crime that we're going to be recording.
So the kind of question I have is about like the context of these things that are occurring, right? So if I've got a kebab shop and my windows get smashed after one of these protests, I may interpret that quite differently to the fact that the same kebab shop gets smashed after a football game. So how do we deal with that?
Oh, I'll tell you later about how we're dealing with hate crimes on the day of the protest itself. Namely, not at all. We're excluding them. So we're not interested in the hate crimes on the protest day itself, but in the following days. And in that specific example that you're mentioning, this would not be categorized as a hate crime. So there needs to be specific reference to this minority group. So if there was a Nazi sign, like a swastika drawn onto the doner kebab shop, then that would be categorized as a hate crime. Just a broken window of that kebab shop would not be categorized as a hate crime. So there needs to be a specific sort of anti-minority sentiment in the crime. So you may think that we will be underestimating sort of the true, hate crimes if they're not as explicit. So this is just a map.
Diego, are you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had my mic off. So how many of those hate crimes are like, because I remember that in those hate crimes, sometimes they categorize also the attacks to the refugee centers. And I was wondering how many of these hate crimes are actually attacks to refugee centers, and when an attack to a refugee center cannot be labeled as a hate crime.
Yeah, so I'm not sure entirely the exact number, but I think between 10 and 12% are arson of refugee facilities. Yeah, and those will be, if a refugee camp is set on fire, then this would typically be classified as a hate crime. Does that answer your question? Great. Okay, so now let me just show you another piece of the raw data. So these are the unit of analysis that we're going to look at, namely the municipalities across Germany. And in blue shades, you will see the hate crimes per 100,000 inhabitants. And then the red dot will represent the location of these Pegida protests over the 2015 to 2020 period, with larger dots representing the size of the protests. So you see substantial variation in the location of these hate crimes. And while you see more protests and hate crimes in the eastern part of Germany, you also see in parts of central Germany that there's both protests and hate crimes, and other places where there's only hate crimes and virtually, sometimes you can see the red dots because they're quite small, but you see fewer protests in these locations, particularly in the southwest of Germany. Okay. So as a first correlation, what we do is we just do a two-way fixed effect model, which is a linear probability model with a dummy variable that switches on if there was a hate crime between Tuesday and Sunday. We're excluding Monday hate crimes because we're less interested in the violent dynamics of large protests, but more about the signaling effect of large protests. We take as our independent variable the number of participants, log +1, on a scheduled Monday protest. We have municipality and week fixed effects, and we have a vector of time varying controls, as well as lagged protest and hate crimes. And let me briefly go through those controls. So we successively include those. We start just with GDP per capita. We have measures for population density, economic factors like the unemployment share. But of course, in order to be able to commit hate crimes, you also need the presence of minorities. So there's the refugee share, there's the latest national vote share for the AfD, which is the political arm of this Pegida movement, to see sort of the latent support for this policy. And then you have crime rate data per 100,000 inhabitants. We also have demographic controls, the share of unskilled, female population share, dummies for age. We have refugee controls, so the vulnerability of the minority population, including foreigners more generally, and the share of asylum status granted. And then we have social media controls at the NUTS 3 level, which is the number of tweets containing refugees welcome as a pro-refugee sentiment. Then also the number of Facebook users, and this is scaled by 2015 population.
Let me ask a question on this occasion. When you have a share of refugees, this is a linear thing, so presumably you're looking for some kind of slope coefficient of that, but apparently there is a non-linear relationship when, you know, if people are exposed to immigrants or refugees, then they become less, you know, this becomes less of a problem. So especially with time, so if people have that experience for a long time, has this been an issue, the refugees, before the 2015 wave? Has this been a salient political issue in Germany that could play a role?
So I see two parts in your question. So the one thing is this idea of how do places that are more or less xenophobic react to exposure to refugees. And I show in another paper in the German context, in the context of the 2015 refugee crisis, that there is sort of a xenophobic sentiment activation that happens. So essentially, you could think of xenophobic sentiment almost as sort of a latent preference that may be dormant in the absence of a trigger. And we actually see in the data that places that are at baseline more xenophobic become even more xenophobic after exposure to refugees in the 2015 crisis. So essentially, these initial differences in xenophobic sentiment are even exacerbated with the arrival of refugees across German municipalities. That's one thing that we find. And then we even find that this is the case despite the fact that refugees in these places are assimilating faster culturally because of pressure. That this does not mitigate the sort of exacerbating effect of exposure. Then the second part of your question is about non-linearities in refugee exposure, and we haven't looked at that in this paper. So what I will show you is that the controls don't do much to the coefficient. But what we could certainly do is try and see whether there's any type of non-linearity in the size of the refugee pool. Later on, we're going to do an interaction effect with the presence of refugees, and we see that stands out. But we could certainly look at non-linear effects there, which we haven't done yet. Thank you.
Sorry, just a quick one. Why do you use the share of refugees instead of the share of Muslims? I mean, when I commit a hate crime, I don't know if the guy is a refugee or a Muslim living in Germany, but I would suspect I would treat probably the same way, you know?
Yeah, so in the German context, about 85% of refugees come from Muslim majority countries. So these are Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But certainly we could also include Muslim majority countries, but I think the refugee share is so concentrated from these countries that will capture a large share of what you have in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, but you wouldn't capture the people from Turkey, right?
Sure. What do you have in mind specifically?
Well, if I am a super right activist and I see someone from Turkey, I might think that they belong to the people who came during the refugee wave, and I don't like refugees. But at first hand, I'm not super rational when I'm committing such a crime, so I might as well commit it against someone who is probably a third-generation immigrant in Germany. But it's
and
just
you would
of Turkish origin.
distinguish between, for you, it's primarily the phenotypical similarity.
Well, I think that in the
Or
mind
should
of someone
we
who commits a
also-
hate crime, it's like a Muslim is a Muslim, probably in the mind of us. If I would have to put them fight activists, I think they would weigh them equally.
So, I mean, I don't know if you've followed this, but one of the largest killing sprees in Germany was committed by the NSU, and they actually also attacked Greek people, and they were facing victimhood. So we have in the controls, I can show you, the share of foreign unemployed and the share of skilled foreigners, which includes all immigrant groups. I would just not know where to draw the line specifically about what is considered a minority that is being attacked or not. So we're quite agnostic there, but we could experiment with just controlling for specific origin countries. Yeah. And in this context, we also control for lagged protest and hate crime to account for any potential serial correlation and really think about the onset of violence in response to large protests. Of course, there's a bunch of endogeneity concerns here, but we just want to show you a first pass at the correlation here. So we consistently find a positive and significant effect of the number of participants on the likelihood of observing a hate crime between Tuesday and Sunday of the same week. Specifically, we find that a 1% increase in the number of participants increases the likelihood of hate crimes by 0.06 percentage points. Conditional on having a protest, think of this as adding 100 participants will raise the probability of observing a hate crime by 5 percentage points. Of course, there's a few endogeneity concerns here. You could think that places that mount these kinds of protests in the first place are on differential trends when it comes to committing hate crimes. For instance, Pegida will pop up in places where there's a latent demand for this movement as measured by, the number of hate crimes that were committed previously. In addition, you could think that even in the absence of pre-existing, preferences for hate crimes in these locations, that you have people who are involved in the organization of the protests, and they are very good at mobilizing people to join the protests. And these are also the same people who are very good at mobilizing people to commit hate crimes. So you would capture sort of the right-wing mobilization potential more than it is the actual signal about the protest. So in a first step, what we do is we do an event study design to check whether places that mount Pegida protests are on differential trends when it comes to their propensity to commit hate crimes. And here we look at the weeks prior and after the first Pegida protest. And we see that there's no increase in the number of hate crimes preceding the first Pegida protest, This is among the ever-treated sample. But we see that right after this first protest, a significant increase in the likelihood of seeing hate crimes, and that effect persists over 4 weeks.
So, sorry, a clarifying question, because you mentioned first Pegida protest in a location. So how many protests are occurring for the first time in a location? Is it a traveling event, or is it typically happening in the same place all the time?
No, it's so essentially how Pegida is organized is it started in the eastern part of Germany, and then essentially it inspired offshoots across the country. So let's say in Dresden, they said, okay, we're starting a Pegida protest, and that may start protests in Hamburg, and then in Munich, and then in Stuttgart. So similar, for instance, to the Black Lives Matter protest, you have sort of a source of the protest organizers, and then sort of other places that start to imitate and also mount these protests across the country. But there's no traveling of the protest organizers themselves.
So how? So if a first protest starts in Dresden, is it likely then it continues every week in Dresden, or then that's extinguished? They've done what they could do in Dresden. Maybe they'll meet in 2 years, but then the next one is somewhere else. Maybe a different group of people. But my question is it occurring many times in the same place, basically?
Yes. So it occurs many times in the same place. And I should have added this graph here, because we have a graph in the paper where we show when exactly different municipalities have their first Pegida protest. And we start basically quarterly, Q1 2015 to Q4 2020. And we see that about 2/3 of the first-time protests happen within the first 5 or 6 quarters between 2015 and mid-2016. And then you still have a few other places, municipalities, that adopt late, but a lot of them happens in 2015 and 2016. Yeah.
I'm sorry, do you see that the point estimates are larger on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as compared to Friday, Saturday, Sunday? Is there a pattern?
So maybe I have it later on. So we look at it by week, and basically when we look at the participants, you see a little bit of a higher increase on Tuesday. But what we see in the quasi-natural experiment, when we use the reduced form with weather, then we see a relatively persistent increase, which flattens out on Saturday and Sunday, there's mixed evidence in the crime literature for whether crime is more likely to occur on weekends versus weekdays. And it typically depends on the type of crime and the opportunity costs involved. So we see our literature, our results more in line with the literature on sort of high risk action, which is more happening in times of like not at daytime, more covert, more at night, less in the weekends when people are out in the evenings and things like that. Yeah.
And another thought was like, do you see differences around Ramadan period? And because Friday also becomes a holy day, so it might bring a rebuttal, some kind of effects.
Interesting. Yeah, no. Like you're thinking about the salience of the refugee community is higher around Muslim holidays, and this is why.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's a good idea. We haven't looked at that, but we can certainly do that. Yeah, thank you. And to tackle the other issue that I mentioned, which is sort of right-wing mobilization potential, that could be a big unobserved factor in both determining the number of participants and the number of hate crimes. We're using weather conditions on these scheduled protest days. So what we do is we interact scheduled protest with a dummy that captures whether there was pleasant weather between 12 p.m. and 8 p.m. on the scheduled protest day. This allows us to control for protest and weather separately. So anything that protest in and of itself does to the likelihood of committing hate crimes. For instance, the most radical fraction will always be at the protest and will always conspire and coordinate to commit hate crimes. This will be captured in the protest control. And there's also in the crime literature an effect of weather conditions on the likelihood of committing hate crimes. So in extreme weather, stress increases, aggression increases, and typically you also see more crimes. So we're kind of can keep those two things separate. What we also do is include a municipality month of the year fixed effect, which allows us to basically identify of deviations of average weather conditions in that municipalities. So you could imagine that, you know, a municipality is less likely to organize large protests when the salience of Christian values is high, for instance, in the pre-Christmas period. And this will also be the time where there may be less hate crimes against refugees. Things like that will be captured by these seasonal fixed effects, not only the weather conditions. What we also do is we interact all of our control variables with protest and with weather. So this allows us to account for, you know, weather interacting with the heterogeneity at the municipality in terms of like baseline characteristics, including baseline crime rates, baseline refugee shares, etc. We show in a balanced test that our sort of treatment variable is uncorrelated with a lot of control variables or that we have. We include many of those in the regression, but as you will see, they don't make a big difference, which sort of alleviates concerns that our treatment is systematically related to unobserved factors at the municipality level that may drive participation in hate crimes. We also show that the number of participants is decreasing in precipitation. So the more it rains, the fewer people participate. And there's sort of a non-linear relationship in terms of temperature. At very low and at very high temperature, you see few participants. What we also show is that the coverage of these protests changes when they occur during pleasant weather. So if you look at the number of tweets about Pegida per capita, they increase when the number of participants is higher, the share of negative tweets increases. And something that we also show is that the negative sentiment of these tweets that mention these protests decreases and decreases consistently in the weeks following protests on pleasant days. Okay. So now I'm showing you essentially the same regression as before, but we're focusing on the reduced form, looking at the effect of protest during pleasant weather on the likelihood of observing a hate crime. So we see that pleasant weather during a protest increases the probability of hate crime by approximately 0.07 percentage points. We do a few things on robustness. We change OLS with probit and logit. We look at not the log participants, but the participants relative to the population size locally. We change the fixed effect structure. We look at state week fixed effects to have different states be on differential trends. We have municipality level time trends, and we have different combinations of those above. We also look at the effects on a higher level of aggregation, if you're concerned about spillover effects. At the NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 level, we also control for weather on the day of the crime itself, in case you're worried that weather is correlated over time and may affect these crimes over time. We leverage daily data, and we make sure that our results hold when we account for spatial correlation in 25-kilometer increments around the county border. Now, we've shown that public support for Pegida increases radical action. So hate crimes and protest success seem to be complements in this context. You can think of two ways how these could be complements, and we've already tried to get as much to the signaling part as possible by sort of leveraging this weather variation and also excluding the crimes on the protest day itself, but now we're trying to go deeper into that. So one way of thinking about this is that in the end, it's nothing about learning something about the preferences of others, but it's just a reduction in coordination costs. Yeah. So in a way, large protests would facilitate coordination for the most extreme fraction of the movement, maybe because they have a larger pool of people to recruit from, or maybe they are more able to sort of coordinate when they hide in the masses. On the other hand, you can think about that it's a signal about other people's preferences, both in terms of decreasing the social punishment of committing hate crime, but also potentially increasing a taste for hate crimes. So sort of among the population that is, hasn't even thought about committing hate crimes, to sort of stir up that sentiment, sort of rather affecting preferences than affecting costs. Those two things are difficult to disentangle, but we're trying different things. So the parts that we're trying to look at for now, and I should say that this is the second time I'm presenting this paper, so any sort of suggestions on how to get to the mechanisms is very much appreciated and will have a large marginal impact at this point. But I'll tell you a little bit what we're doing now. So we start with the diffusion of the protest signal across space and through social media networks, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. We look at the type of hate crimes. We look at counter-mobilization, so our pro-refugee activists really engaging. We look at how people do belief updating, and to get to Valeria's point before, we're also going to look at football matches to distinguish between protest as a signal versus protest as a conglomeration or coordination device. And we're currently working on that. Okay, so let me start with the diffusion of the signal. As I said, we're looking at three types of signals. One of them is just geographic distance. The other one is broader social media networks, particularly on Twitter. And the third one is right-wing social media networks on Twitter. And I'll talk a bit more in detail how we do that. So for geographic proximity, what we basically do is we calculate the distance, the geographic distance of a municipality to other municipalities and weigh that by the size of the protests in the other municipality. Yeah, so that basically tells you a large SITG will tell you that I'm geographically close to municipalities that have large protests. Yeah, we do a cutoff at 100 kilometers, otherwise you're getting sort of almost a uniform treatment, but this is robust to increasing it to 200 kilometers and decreasing it to 50. We have a similar intuition when we look at social media proximity. So what we do is now it's not the geographic proximity, but it's essentially the retweet or the engagement with people from a specific municipality. So what we do is we collect a random sample of German language tweets, always over the past 6 months. And then we take the number of retweets that were done based on tweets that were originally posted in a specific district. So the idea is, if I retweet you a lot, then I give a lot of attention to you, and that means you're more closer to me, yeah? So this also means that this measure can be asymmetric. I can pay a lot of attention to you without you paying a lot of attention to me. And we measure attention with the number of retweets that people from a certain municipalities make of a specific destination district, essentially. And we use that as a social media network proximity measure and do the same thing and weigh that by the size of the protest at destination. So a high SITW will tell you that I am retweeting places a lot that have a high number of protest participants. So I'm connected on a social media level to any sort of activity that is taking place in the destination municipality.
Can I ask here whether there's any try to identify any sort of bots that could be involved here and try to amplify the message, and how I don't even know whether they have any link to a district, whether they can be located at all.
Mm-hmm. So typically bots will have a very hard time to be geolocated. So we are only able to geolocate about 25% of our sample. So what essentially happens is that these one-off bots typically are very hard to geolocate, so they typically fall out of the sample. But what we haven't done explicitly is to take a random sample of those geolocated tweets and check for the bot rate. Yeah, this is something that we can definitely do. Yeah.
But even if you have the 75% that are not geolocated, they can contribute to, you know, how popular the message is in a given time, and that can increase the probability of retweeting of a geolocated tweeter.
Exactly. So we would be capturing how likely it is, given the popularity of a certain tweet, that somebody that can be geolocated,
I see,
will retweet that, and that differs across different municipalities, and that's the kind of attention that I'm paying to certain destination posts. That's right. Yeah.
Can I ask a question at this point?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
So this location data is how often is it visible on the tweets? Are you only focusing on tweets that have the location data?
Yes, exactly. We can only build this measure for Twitter data that where the person that posts the tweet has an indication of their location in their profile.
Yeah, I'm a bit concerned in the sense that, you know, people's choices of whether or not to report their location might be related to their, you know, tendencies of, you know, political tendencies and other types of tendencies. I was wondering if you could check, like, if there is a difference in terms of, you know, whether people's tendency to report their location changes over locations, especially those locations which, you know, are exposed to these protests.
So anything time varying will not be able to do. So what we can, because the Twitter API basically allows you to do a snapshot of the environment. So if you don't collect snapshots at different times, you don't know whether a given profile changes their likelihood of locating. But what we can try to do is just correlate, take the creation date of different Twitter profiles and then correlate whether or check whether the features of these profiles change with exposure to protests. But this will obviously, anything that we relate to protests will have to be geolocated in some way. What we also can do is check whether the characteristics of tweets that can be of municipalities that have tweets differ systematically from those that don't. That's something that we can do, and we have done for another paper, and we can do that. Would that address some of your concern?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind about the time series information. I would, a cross-sectional check I think would be sufficient.
Right, okay. No, we can definitely do that. Thank you for that suggestion. And just to add to the general social media network, we also do that for the right-wing social media network. So now it's not a random sample of tweets, but it's the tweets and retweets that contain the word Pegida, right? And so anybody that sort of engages with that content is sort of in that right-wing social media network. Okay. So again, we look at geographic proximity, and we don't see that geographic proximity to large protest locations increases the likelihood of observing a hate crime. We do that with social media proximity, and we see a positive and significant effect on the likelihood, and we do that with the right-wing social media network, and see that that also increases the likelihood of hate crime. It's important to note that we're controlling for local protest participation in all of these regressions. Yeah, so this is just the conditional on having a local large protest. What is the effect of being close to another municipality that has a large protest? When we run a horse race between all of these connectivity measures, we actually see that the right-wing social media network is the one that contributes to the diffusion of hate crimes. Geographic proximity or general social media proximity does not. Yeah. We also look at, yeah,
just a clarification about this last Pegida. You call it right-wing network, but then you said these are retweets that contain the word Pegida. It doesn't have to be, in that case, a right-wing network, because if I retweet criticizing and I'm a leftist, how does this count then?
Yeah, so we try to double check that using the refugee welcome tweets. So we're basically trying to check, because the refugee welcome tweets we've manually classified as pro or against refugees. And we basically wanted to see whether being decidedly pro-refugee somehow correlates with this Pegida proximity, and that doesn't seem to be the case. One thing that we can do, but it costs us a lot of time, is to try and, because the sentiment analysis will not be able to tell you whether these are pro or against Pegida. One thing that we could do is do the same for the Pegida tweets and classify them manually as pro or counter, and then train an algorithm to check the rest. This is what we've done for the refugee welcome tweets, because we've done that for a different project, but we could repeat that with this one to be sure. Qualitatively, my prior is that the retweets are typically sympathetic towards the movement, but we should check this more explicitly. Yeah.
And also, I don't know if this is relevant. Another question is: do you weight by sort of centrality? So when we have a Twitter network, some people have 5 followers, some people are journalists who have thousands of followers. Do you weight this in some sense?
No, but we could, because we have when in the beginning, we were mostly interested in the social media angle. So we've mapped out the Pegida network. And as you correctly say, there are a few central accounts, which are actually not the official Pegida account, but right-wing influencers that actually have the most followers. But we haven't done anything with that. So I think we could try to also get at a measure of centrality, as you say, with where that tweet actually comes from and who is tweeting it and how many other engagements this tweet has. That's definitely something we can do. Yeah, thank you. Okay. What we also look at is at the type of hate crime committed. So we have a classification that goes from assault to rally to arson. And we see that there is sort of a move towards more overt forms of hate crimes. So those that can be committed more surreptitiously, like arson, you know, at night when you just, light a refugee camp on fire. This is something that you could do without revealing your identity, but sort of more overt forms of violence like physical assault and rallies. Those are the things that seem to increase after a protest on a pleasant day, which sort of is indicative of a reduced social cost to committing these types of hate crimes.
Sulin, just a reminder, you have 3-4 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, that'll be enough. Another thing that we look at is counter mobilization. So if you think it's really about a signal about other people's preferences, this may reduce the social cost of committing hate crimes for the people that are inclined to do so. But it will also be a signal to those that are pro-refugee in terms of that they have to sort of take radical action to achieve their political goal. Now, pro-refugee radical action is hard to measure. So we take the next best proxy, which is decidedly pro-refugee tweets online. And we see that the effect is large, a little bit imprecisely estimated. I should have shown the reduced form here. This is, but it goes in the same direction. So we see that on protest days that happen during pleasant weather, the number of pro-refugee tweets increases. A last thing that we look at is sort of the belief updating and the dynamics. I already told you that we're controlling for lagged protests and hate crimes, but what we're trying to get at is to understand whether this is just sort of an emotional response or whether there's some learning over time about how acceptable these hate crimes are. And potentially because of that, initial small differences in sort of the propensity to commit hate crimes can magnify over time. And this is exactly what we find. So if we interact the number of participants with the past cumulative protests or the past cumulative participants and the past cumulative hate crimes, you see, as well as their first principal component, you see a compounding effect. And you also see that when you look at the reduced form with weather and protest, that these continuous reminders of sort of the broad support of this movement amplifies this effect, and that can really lead to a vicious cycle of violence, even with small differences initially. I'm going to skip the mediating forces, both in terms of social media and economic grievances, but let me just tell you briefly here that we don't see any heterogeneity based on sort of GDP, unemployment rate, the share of low skill. The only thing that is determining of hate crimes is the mere presence of minority groups. To sum up, we ask in this paper what the effect of protest success is on radical action, and we study this in the context of the ascent of the largest right-wing movement post-World War II in Germany, which is called Pegida, and hate crimes against refugees. We find that protest success and radical action are complements, and we find suggestive evidence for a reduction in the social cost of committing hate crimes, a diffusion through right-wing social networks, and a shift to more brazen forms of violence. We also see a polarized effect of protest participation and a persistent increase in hate crimes, and as well as cumulative effects over time, which may tell you that, you know, initial differences in protest participation can really lead to a vicious cycle of violence, a polarized constituency, and you know, move of an overt window towards things that are acceptable, which wouldn't have been otherwise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sulin.